What do you do when your faith system no longer fits? Because sometimes you outgrow it. Sometimes you graduate, you ascend, you leave the old, itchy, worn-out way, and you begin to walk in the new. Sometimes you grow. Join the conversation with me, tonywuerfel, author, speaker, teaching pastor, as we help unwrap and rebuild a faith that no longer fits. We learn to walk into the new, messy journey called life. Hello everyone, and welcome back. Today, we're going to move through, again, a couple more questions because they've been piling up, and so I want to try to get to some of these. I want to respect that you've taken your time to ask them, so I want to respect your questions and go through them together. And again, if you don't like what I say, let's get that discussion going. Post some comments, some reviews. Let's discuss this idea. So the first question I had was this, and I basically only have time for two today because I have a feeling number one's going to take a bit. The first question was this: where in the Bible does it say you shouldn't have sex before marriage? Now, anyone with kids, you're cringing right now, right? So here is my answer. And again, this may not be a popular answer, truth be told, but I'm going to give it to you honestly and straightforward. The reality is the Bible, nowhere in the Bible is it as clear as you might think when it comes to sex before marriage, especially as far as Christians are concerned. In fact, though the Bible does generally condemn sexual immorality, which is almost always a reference towards someone abusing their power over another person, like rape, there is no clear prohibition against premarital sex in the Bible. So, in short, the answer to my friend from Minnesota, Aaron, the answer is no. Sex before marriage is not forbidden in the Bible. No matter how upsetting this is going to be for some people listening with more traditional moral values, that's just the fact of the matter. So, short answer, no, the Bible doesn't actually speak to this idea of what we're talking about, sex before marriage, premarital sex. Now, some people, they will often attempt to say that the act of sex before marriage is adultery. But that's actually a pretty big stretch. Adultery, according to the Bible, is when one or both people engaging in sex with one another is already in a committed relationship with someone else. So strictly speaking, the commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery, this is Exodus 20:14, it doesn't apply to sex before marriage. So let that sink in for a moment. Now, some verses people will often use to attempt to kind of explain this and keep to the idea of no premarital sex. They'll go to Deuteronomy 22, 13 through 21. And essentially, this was this law that said if a woman is found to not be a virgin on her wedding day or her wedding night, she'd be stoned to death in front of her father's home. So why was this something punishable by death, you might be asking? The idea here was that a woman was considered like livestock, basically. They wanted their women to be considered pure before the idea in the Hebrew is men would defile them. That process was considered a man's rights. So a woman's identity, her value, came from her appearing pure in order for a man to engage in this sexual moment with her. So a woman's value came from her not have had sex yet, right? So again, when you consider that, you know, the way that's actually really referring to in the historical context, it's actually pretty barbaric. It's kind of gross to say that a woman's value is only in what she gives to this man who's about to defile her. A woman's value comes from whether she's had sex or not. In our culture, we would say yuck. Like that cannot be where their value. It cannot be that. That can't be where a woman's value comes from. This is gross. It's barbaric. Another place they'll go to, Deuteronomy 22, 28, and 29. If a man meets a virgin who is not engaged and seizes her, lies with her, and they're caught in this act, the man who lays with her, he's supposed to give 50 shekels of silver to the young woman's father. And again, notice like he's not murdered for this act. but she's now supposed to be his wife. Again, like, think about how gross this would be. In our culture today, a man rapes a woman, he has to give the father money, and the woman now becomes his bride. So understand, in that very barbaric, tribal kind of culture, he violates her, and now, like, the idea is, since her purity is taken, it's actually the father that suffers, because the father's hoping to get money in return, right? That's the idea here. And so, because he's violated her, he's not permitted to divorce her as long as he lives. So, a lot of interesting stuff going on. So please understand, he gives the father money, again, because she is considered worthless now. The father marries his daughter off in hopes of property given to for her hand, but by her being raped, he essentially loses money, and he's owed something. So this had nothing to do with her purity or her value as a woman. It was a money exchange. So the majority of the verses used in this argument by most fundamentalists they're a joke to me, when you either look at the actual historical context or the rituals associated with it. It's pretty demeaning to women as well. So for most of the verses used about purity, you have to keep in mind this was a male-dominated culture that saw women as the lesser. They were often associated as goods. So the majority of the discussion about a woman's purity was because men valued virgins. They saw the virgin as the pure belonging that they would sleep with and thus make theirs. It's barbaric. So when put this way, it's a different discussion. So here's the question I might pose: what do we do with this now? What do we do now that we get to this place, especially with our kids? I've got a daughter. How do we talk about this? Like premarital sex? Because I don't want my daughter like going around sleeping with everyone. I don't think that's probably healthy either. So what do we do? I've actually come to see that sex before marriage discussion is really less and less compelling when it's compared to the discussion, the larger discussion of monogamy. Learning to be with one person in a lasting, loving, mutually respectful relationship. Something you actually don't find much, if we're going to be honest, in the Bible. When you look at the Bible, you'll find many examples of polygamy, incest, rape. There's all this stuff going on. While there's not much of an interesting discussion, though, about sex before marriage, I would argue the discussion over searching for that monogamous, loving relationship, that should actually be the goal, especially as parents. So here's my question to many of you parents out there, or even teachers. What if instead of like trying to guilt our kids and shaming our kids about losing their purity or sinning against God, like what if we discuss with them what mutual respect and relationships looked like? What if we actually modeled that? What it means to be in commitment to one another, how sex plays into the deeper ideas of being in relationship with someone. What if that was the discussion we had with them? We modeled it. We talked about it. I feel like that's a much deeper conversation than whether someone's had sex before marriage. So lately, I found actually the most helpful advice about marriage wasn't in the Bible, but it's actually in an interview with Oprah. And she's interviewing Jay-Z and Beyonce. And some of you are like, wait, what? But hold on, listen. Jay-Z and Beyonce, they've actually been married for 10 years, dated for 5. And again, for Hollywood standards, that's kind of shocking. And here's the thing. They believe in monogamy, which I think is the real issue. Learning to be with one person. Because let's be honest, when we've seen people who seem to trade in lovers like they do a pair of shoes, most of them aren't happy. And I think that's a far better argument for monogamy. And so this interview went that the two, she explained that the two actually got to know each other first. So for the first 5 years of dating, she says they had lots of conversation. And they actually spent the first year and a half. Now get this, I was blown away. I wasn't even sure I believed it at first. She said they spent the first year and a half only speaking on the phone, nothing physical. Interesting, right? But during that time, Beyonce said they really got to know each other. And she claims they got to know each other on a deeper level than she'd ever known anyone else. And some of the words and phrasing she said, I actually liked him before I loved him, which is kind of interesting. And she said, I actually love coming home to him. And maybe that's the discussion we should have with the kids first. What if we spent more time living out happy monogamous relationships and less time shaming kids and talking fear into kids about losing one's purity, one's salvation, these different words that we kind of throw around loosely? What if we help them desire intimacy over simply like 5 minutes of pleasure? What if intimacy was the way we had conversation about sex? Seems to me we'd have a much healthier conversation about sex and intimacy if we started there rather than attempting to use this ancient book to shame and guilt kids out of not having sex. It's just one way of looking at it. Again, send in your responses. You may have hated what I just said. When my daughter becomes a teenager, I'll let you know how that works. Another question that was posed, and I thought this was really an interesting one. This one came from Maryland, and Robert asked this one. And so Robert in Maryland, why does an atheist need God? What a great question. I feel like that could be a whole podcast in itself, but I'm going to do my best to kind of answer that as fully as I can with the time I have. But let me start here. I'll just again say it very plainly. I don't know that an atheist does need God in the traditional sense. So my friends who identify as non-theists or post-theists or even panentheists, they need the word God, but not the traditional understanding. So let me tease that out a little bit. They need the word because there's a scholar, Marcus Borg. He believed that if we lose our exclusive Christian language, we actually lose Christianity. And so clergy who continue to use a word that's understood by most people in church pews and beyond to mean like a supernatural theistic being who can intervene in human affairs if it wants to, may well be working to preserve Christianity, but are already, I believe, pretty far outside of what is generally assumed by most to mean. At least those people who are panentheists, post-theists, non-theists. So maybe our ideas of God need to be given a new breath. Language beyond the white, middle-aged being up in the sky, looking down, notepad in hand. I think there are better ways to understand the idea of God that can be inclusive to actually everyone. And maybe I'm naive here. Maybe that'll change in a couple of years. But what if we begin associating God, the idea of God as like the ground of being, the energy, the force that keeps all life moving, the thing that can't be understood behind the curtain of evolution? And so what if we talked of God in terms of the events of justice and mercy all around us today? I think if we understood God in this sense of the word, the discussion over the question posed, it becomes a very different one. It actually changes into something really tangible, relatable for everyone who comes to the table to offer hope, love, generosity, grace, all of that. It becomes relatable. It becomes a thing we can all talk about. And I don't think an atheist needs a traditional God up in the heavens for morality and ethic, because I know many who are in some ways more ethical, more moral human beings than many of my Christian friends. But I would argue we all need the events of justice and mercy, the ground of being that keeps everything moving, growing. We need love. We need the mystery behind the curtain. And so my response would be that. I think no and yes. I think we have to reframe the idea of God. And once we do the reframing, that has to happen in Christianity. It has to happen. And if it doesn't, Christianity is facing an eventual death here. But if it can reframe this idea, knowing that God is not a middle-aged white man upstairs, but the act, the love, the justice in the world, the thing keeping everything moving and growing. If you can have that discussion, more panentheist, then I think the two can come together. And the word God, maybe we use different words now because that word has so much baggage. I don't know. But I think that when we begin to use these concepts, ground of being, the idea of God as the event, the bigger thing, I think we begin to have a bigger, deeper discussion. So I hope that was helpful for my two friends that sent those questions. And again, if you disagree or you agree, please, let's keep this conversation going. I think this is what we need to be discussing. And especially for so many of us who are reframing, changing, having our faith undone a bit, we need to renegotiate what it all looks like. And I think it starts with conversation. So again, hopefully this was helpful. Keep those questions coming. This is so much fun. And next week, we'll talk about the ideas behind the Exodus plagues. Were these actual plagues? Did Israel's God really murder all those innocent people in Egypt? Why all the destruction? How do we talk about this ancient story? Do we just throw it out? Or are there some things that we could still hold on to that are beautiful? Anyways, we'll have that discussion next week. Blessings, everyone. And as always, please go to my Patreon page or tonywuerfel.com and give a one-time donation. Set up a review on the podcast, whatever you can do to help spread this thing. Have a great day. Talk to you soon. Bye.